morning, everybody. My name is, like I'm at school. My name is Patricia Lewis. I'm the Research Director here for International Security. And I'm delighted to have with us here to discuss the Iran nuclear deal, reflections on the first 2 years. Former Secretary US of State John Kerry and Baroness Ashton of Holland, Catherine Ashton. Welcome, both of you. So I'm sure that both of my speakers need no introduction. Secretary Kerry was the 68th Secretary of State of the United States, serving from 2013 to 2016. He was the first sitting Secretary of State to meet with Iran's foreign minister since the Iranian Revolution. And he was also a key architect of the Paris Climate Accord, signing the historic agreement to reduce carbon emissions in 2016. Prior to being nominated and sworn in as Secretary of State, John Kerry served for more than 28 years as a US Senator from Massachusetts. He eventually served on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee as chair. Shortly before he graduated from Yale, Secretary Kerry volunteered for service in the US Navy. He completed 2 tours of duty in Vietnam, after which he began a lifelong fight for his fellow veterans as a co-founder of the Vietnam Veterans in America. And in the lead up to Remembrance Day, Secretary Kerry, which is coming up on the 11th of November, I'm sure you'll be reflecting on the importance of conflict prevention. Currently, Secretary Kerry is visiting distinguished statesmen at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, where he is focusing on conflict resolution and global environmental challenges, and is a distinguished fellow for global affairs at Yale. Baroness Ashton serves as the High Representative of the European Union for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy from 2009 to 2014. And in that capacity led the EU 3+3 negotiations with Iran that year, that a year later became the JCPOA. Baroness Ashton was leader of the House of Lords and Lord President of the Council in 2007. In 2008, she was appointed as the first woman British Commissioner, and so far the only British woman Commissioner. That might change, I hope. And became the Commissioner for Trade in the European Commission. Currently, Baroness Ashton is a member of the panel of senior advisors at Chatham House and Chancellor of Warwick University, as well as being chair of the John Smith Trust, a member of the Global Leadership Foundation, and is a Woodrow Wilson Scholar. Welcome to both of you. Secretary Kerry, we're 2 years on, and as a Norwegian friend of mine would say, there's a lot of spilt milk that has flown under the bridge since then.
That's a hell of a metaphor.
It's a great one. Can you characterize what you think has happened in the last 2 years, and particularly what's happening now with President Trump's decision not to certify and move the decisions back to Congress as to what will happen with the US participation in the JCPOA?
Well, Patricia, thank you. First of all, thank you to Chatham House. It's wonderful to be back here. I have good memories of being here a year ago when you all very kindly recognized the Iran deal, and I appreciate the gesture very, very much. I'm delighted to be invited back as a former senator of the United States Senate. I'm delighted to be invited anywhere, folks. It's a privilege. Cathy Ashton has become a great friend. I don't think Britain or Europe really adequately have ever said thank you to her and to Simon and Cass and the whole group of the British team, who were a very significant part of arriving at the Iran nuclear agreement, as well as our French friends, our German friends, and even China and Russia played extremely important and significant roles. This was truly a global, multilateral effort, and in a world where we're seeing, frankly, I think so many unnecessary exacerbations of conflict, it's particularly gratifying to see that global structure come together and work effectively. We need a lot more of it, not less of it. and the tendency for authoritarian populism in a number of different places in the world today should be deeply disturbing to all Democrats, little d. And I think we need to be spending a lot more time talking about the difficulties of governance, which are really characterizing the planet today. In my judgment, we now face a challenge of the diminution of the global order that was set up after World War II, which some Russian friends of ours suggested in recent times is in fact what is happening. We're seeing the world change because of technology and transformations taking place, and we are seeing increased levels of corruption. And that is creating more and more challenges to governance, and it's one of the reasons why we see more failed states and failing states. So there's a lot that's going on, and within which we have to think about the Iran nuclear agreement. That's one of the reasons why I wanted to come here today and talk not just to you here, but I hope talk to our friends in Europe and in the region who are deeply committed to sensible, well thought out, strategic approaches to the challenges that we face in the world, and none are bigger than the challenges of nuclear weapons, obviously. There was a time when the United States and Russia, the Soviet Union, had 50,000 nuclear warheads pointed at each other. And we managed to turn the corner and move in a different direction, beginning with the meeting of Gorbachev and President Reagan in Reykjavik. So this kind of conversation is important, and I want to put my comments this morning about the Iran nuclear agreement in the context of this journey traveled, and yet road not yet traveled, but which needs to be traveled far more thoughtfully and effectively than the way we're proceeding. So let's talk about the Iran nuclear agreement in the context of Patricia's question. And first of all, I think it's important to just note the simple things. The Iran nuclear agreement is working. It is doing precisely what it was set up to do. I've heard some people, including the President of the United States, say it's a violation, there's a violation of the spirit of the deal. Well, as one of the principal negotiators of that agreement, let me just say to you, there was no spirit of the deal. There is no spirit of the deal. The deal is contained within the four corners of the agreement itself, period. And that was a specific decision agreed upon with the United States Congress, the administration, and all of the participants, that we were not going to try to solve the problem, which are legitimate problems, of missiles, interference in other countries, Hezbollah, arms transactions. All of these are serious, folks. And never once in the course of our negotiation did we backburner them. We just recognized that it did not make sense strategically to try to arrive at an agreement on nuclear weapons where you might be bargaining off something to do with nuclear in exchange for missiles or other behavior in the region. Those have to be managed, but they have to be managed separately. Why? Because the single goal which we kept in our vision always was, if you're going to deal with an Iran or any country, not just Iran, by the way, that is acting in your judgment outside of the norms of global behavior, it is better to deal with that country if it doesn't have a nuclear weapon than if it does. It's a very simple proposition. Now, that becomes even more underscored in the context of what we see with North Korea today. But let me leave that aside for a minute. I want you to focus on the reality of where we are. And I want to, be very direct, and I usually try to be a fair broker in all of this. Iran made its own decision. And Iran doesn't get credit for its own decision. Iran decided not to pursue a nuclear weapon. And Iran stepped up to the plate, yes, to get rid of sanctions, but also because the Ayatollah, the supreme leader, made a decision that they were not going to pursue it. Now, to underscore the importance of what I just said, let's go back to where we were when we began. And that is a really vital place to focus on in the context of the choice that President Trump is trying to present to the Congress and to the world. Now, let me just also underscore, the decision to decertify was made without relevance to any fact whatsoever with respect to this agreement. The IAEA has in fact certified that Iran has been meeting this agreement and is fully compliant with the agreement 8 separate times. So there is no science, no fact, not any evidence whatsoever that would merit a, quote, decertification. This is just pulled out of holes, pulled out of the sky, bolt of blue, if you will. And so it has been now flipped over to the Congress of the United States with instructions. You guys fix it. Well, how the United States Congress, which wasn't part of the negotiations, isn't today certified to be part of the negotiations, quote, fixes an agreement which is working, is beyond me. But obviously, it's something else. It's an invitation for the potential of mischief. And the great danger is that if the Congress were to decide to do something that actually had substantive impact on the agreement or on Iran in a way that alters the politics of Iran, then we wind up in a situation where an external actor, not one of the players directly party to the agreement, is unilaterally renegotiating the agreement, and Iran would be quite justified in saying that has no relevance at all. But you know what it has relevance to? It has relevance to the politics of our country and of Iran. And it would be a gigantic, historic mistake when dealing with nuclear weapons to allow anyone's politics to get in the way and break apart an agreement which is preventing a country from pursuing a nuclear weapon, to the agreement of Iran and the rest of the world that this is the process that we will pursue. Now, let me be very specific here. The world knows what the world looks like without an agreement on Iran. We all know what the world looks like without an agreement in place on Iran. And I'll tell you what it is. Because the day that I sat down with Javad Zarif, the first Secretary of State to do so in 35 years, Iran had 19,000 centrifuges spinning. It had 27,000 deployed. Iran had 12,000 kilograms of enriched nuclear material at about 20%, with an easy capacity to go up to 80, 90% for bomb making if it wanted to. Iran had completely mastered the nuclear cycle. Iran had the Arak Reactor, which was a plutonium reactor, rushing towards commission, maybe a few months away from commissioning, which would have produced enough plutonium weapons-grade material for at least 2 bombs a year. The 12,000 kilograms they had was enough weapons-grade material for enough material to become weapons grade that would have produced 10 to 12 bombs a year. And it was the judgment of our intelligence community and all the intelligence communities working on this that Iran was maybe 2 months away from breaking out, from a breakout capacity. That, my friends, is the world without the Iran nuclear agreement. Now, Iran could have made the decision, it didn't, it could have, that it didn't want to do a deal. It wanted to break out. But all these people who oppose the deal are just ignoring that reality. They're ignoring the reality that the Ayatollah issued a fatwa and said we're not going to pursue a nuclear weapon. They're ignoring the reality that the Iranians came to the table to negotiate away this ability they had only a couple of months away from the ability to go make a bomb. And they're presuming the worst. I've heard this from directly. We don't believe Iran isn't going to make a nuclear weapon. Well, let me just be very clear. I'm not sitting here after these many years in public life, naive and a beginner to the process of negotiating or even of nuclear agreements. I voted in the Senate. I worked on any number of agreements with the Soviet Union, with Russia. We know something about how to arrive at good agreements. And let me tell you, folks, when the intel community of the entire Perm 5 and of the United States and our energy departments say to me, we have confidence that we have the ability to know whether or not Iran is producing a nuclear weapon under this agreement, I accept that judgment. Now, we put in place with Iran, and mind you, everything we did with Iran, Iran agreed to. This is with their consent. We put in place the most significant, intrusive, extensive, transparent nuclear agreement that exists on this planet. And when I hear high-level people, elected or otherwise, saying, well, we're concerned about the sunset components of this agreement, I react adversely because I think people are being misled by those statements. Yes, there are some sunset components to the agreement in the sense that you transition from a very extensive restraint to a lesser restraint, but still a restraint. So after 15 years, things changed to some degree in what Iran is permitted to do. But that's because over those 15 years, Iran presumably will have earned its way to a level of understanding of their program, of scrutiny of their program, of visibility on their program, that we have confidence about the future. Between now and 15 years, folks, Iran is limited to 300 kilograms of enriched material. And they are limited to a 3.67% enrichment level. Any physicist, anybody in the world who knows anything about nuclear weapons will confirm what I am about to say to you. It is physically impossible to make a bomb with 300 kilograms and with 3.67%. So we know, sitting here today, that at least 15 years, there's not even the possibility unless Iran were to decide to break out. But it doesn't end at 15 years. For 20 years, we have visibility with television cameras looking at every single centrifuge being produced. And at the same time, for 25 years, we have cradle-to-grave visibility on every single ounce of uranium that is mined in Iran, milled, put into yellow cake, put into the centrifuge, out of the centrifuge in waste, every ounce of it accounted for. We have electronic seals on centrifuges, radio transmitting. We have 130 additional people that Iran accepted to come into Iran, live in Iran, be there 24 hours a day, who are reviewing every aspect of this agreement. We will know in a nanosecond if Iran decides to suddenly try to tick up its enrichment or its centrifuges or its production or any other aspect of this agreement. So, you know, it bothers me that people are being misled as much when it comes to something as important as nuclear weapons. For 25 years, we have that cradle to grave. Now, what happens after 25 years? You say, well, here's what happens, folks. Iran has also signed up to and agreed to live by something called the Additional Protocol. The Additional Protocol is a very extensive inspection regime that has been put in place because of the failure in 1990s of the oversight of the North Korean deal. So as a result, what has been put in place is a right to inspect, lifetime right to inspect. And we made certain that that right to inspect cannot be held up in a vote or in the UN Security Council in a way that adversely affects the application to this agreement. Specifically, we have a joint commission The Joint Commission is the 7 countries that signed the deal, but we have a majority vote. If the majority of the signatories of this agreement decide that there is a facility that must be inspected because it is suspect, we, by majority vote, have a right to enforce it. And the UN has a right to enforce it. And if it isn't, if we are not permitted to have that inspection, all the sanctions snap back immediately and automatically. Automatically. And no nation can stop them from snapping back because we put in place a reverse vote. But France, Germany, Britain, and the United States, that's 4 countries. If China, and I'm not saying China or Russia would necessarily agree with Iran, but if they did decide to, you'd have a 4-3 vote. We still have the right to enforce this agreement. Now, that is for lifetime. So let me just wrap this fully into this bottom line. This agreement, by agreement with Iran, has rid the region of a nuclear weapon. It has set an example for North Korea as to how international behavior is critical and how countries could come together to properly live up to an agreement. It is made not only the region safer, Israel is safer. The security folks in Israel believe this agreement is working, and they don't want to see it go away. The truth is that high-level people who look at this analytically understand it's working. And the simple question is, why on earth would you voluntarily, with the peril of North Korea staring us in the face, want to throw away an agreement that is working in order to make what could be a potential decision of Iran 15, 20 years from now, a decision that is made tomorrow? And the United States of America, in doing that, would lose all credibility because we would have forced the issue. The United States would have walked away from an agreement that we led in many ways trying to achieve, and we would have made the region and the world less safe. And if Iran did go back and start enriching, I guarantee you, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Emirates, Turkey, all of these countries will suddenly engage in a nuclear arms race. That's the importance of this agreement. And it's disappointing to me as a child of the Cold War, as somebody who went to school early on, being taught that we had to get under the desk and cover our heads in the event of a nuclear explosion, and practicing for that eventuality, and having lived through the Cuban Missile Crisis when I was a freshman in college. It is really sad for me to see my country and our president putting this issue in such peril in the way that he is. I think it's walking back on the responsibilities which our country has lived up to so effectively for so long. And it has the potential to make the world far more dangerous, not safer. So that's the summary of where we are today, and I'd be delighted to pick up in any way that anybody would like to.
Thank you, Secretary Kerry. That's a lot of spilt milk. But I do...
Well, I was putting it back in the jar, actually.
We had Mr. Netanyahu sitting here on Friday outlining his concerns about this deal and looking forward, not looking forward, but looking to a future in 15 years or so when you have a wealthier Iran, a more technically competent Iran, and an Iran that is then able to use that position of strength which seems to be gaining in the region in a position to develop new programs for nuclear missiles with its new missile program. And there are no constraints on missiles. We have the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which holds all of our feet to the fire, the members of it, but we have no international deal on missiles. Now,
Yeah, but
let me just
Okay.
because he has not accepted what you've said.
That's
and,
correct.
And other neighbors of Iran also have not accepted this. And my question really is, what are we hoping that the Congress might be able to do? I mean, clearly, the issue of missiles is a wider issue than just Iran. We have a proliferation of ballistic missiles. Regional ballistic missiles are one thing. Long-range ballistic missiles are another. Long-range ballistic missiles are so inaccurate that they only make sense if you've also got a nuclear program or a weapon of mass destruction program. So what is it Congress might be able to do that could help this deal move forward without wrecking it completely?
Well, let me let me just say that you know, I had many discussions with Prime Minister Netanyahu, long face-to-face conversations, long telephone calls, and I disagreed with him from day one as to how he saw where this takes us. Prime Minister Netanyahu was urging President Obama to bomb Iran. Every leader I met with in the region, King Abdullah, may God rest his soul, President Mubarak, personally, to my face, said, you have to bomb Iran. That's the only thing they understand. And that's the only way you'll stop them having a nuclear weapon. Well, number one, folks, bombing Iran does not necessarily stop them from having a nuclear weapon. It's the same dilemma we face with North Korea. We don't know where everything is. And I guarantee you, once you've bombed a country, you have surely given them a good reason to want to have a weapon. And what is taking place today in open transparency will disappear. Iran, I mean, Prime Minister Netanyahu does not pay attention to what I just said, that they've already mastered the nuclear cycle. They already had enough to go get a bomb. They could have already dug 2 miles deep in a mountain in Iran, which we have confidence they haven't. But I guarantee you, you bomb them, they will.
So what can
And
Congress
no
do?
one in the region is going to be safer for having a nuclear arms race. I mean, they're just not going to be safer. The world, I mean, Dr. Kissinger, former Secretary Perry, former Secretary Schlesinger, a whole group of eminence grises who have thought about this for a long time are trying to move the world to a different direction to talk about minimizing nuclear weapons, ultimately, hopefully getting rid of them, which obviously requires a major transformation in conflict resolution on this planet and in human behavior. But it is not a bad thing to aspire to, because every step you take in order to move in that direction is a step that makes you safer, as long as you don't open up a world of people doubting deterrence and having an ability to sort of try to take advantage of it. I believe in deterrence, and I think that's one of the things you obviously have to work on as you go forward in that thinking. But the point I'm making is that I think this notion that a global agreement on nuclear weapons, which we managed so effectively with the Soviet Union for so many years, which we managed with China, which we managed globally, is somehow not capable of being effective in Iran, is wrong. And I think, let me just put it very bluntly to everybody. Every single military option we have available to us today, we will have available to us in 15 years. So this notion that Iran is somehow over these years going to put itself in a position to do something it can't do today is ridiculous. And if it did try to do it in 15 or 20 or 30 or 50 years, we will be in a far better position to know what they are doing and to have an impact. Every military option available to us today will be available to us in 15 years. Now, what leadership is it that suggests it is better to have that confrontation today than to try to work over these 15 years to deal with the missile program, to deal with Yemen, to deal with human rights, to deal with Hezbollah, and see if those 65% of the population of Iran, kids who are under the age of 30, aren't going to change Iran going forward. I'll bet you they are. That's my bet. And if it isn't a bet that I win, we're still in the same position to protect ourselves then as we are today. So we lose nothing, nothing. What is this rush to war? What is this rush to conflict? What is this notion that we have to take what could be delayed for 15 years and make it happen tomorrow, even as we're in the middle of the North Korea and other kinds of conflicts? It doesn't make sense, folks, please. It really doesn't make sense. I'm not questioning his doubts. I'm not questioning anybody's right to be skeptical. This is not something that's built on trust, it's built on verification. It's built on transparency. It's built on knowledge. What I do know is this: we have a 1-year breakout time now, today, because of the deal we made. And we will have a 1-year breakout time in the years ahead. Why would we not be then satisfied to use that 1 year instead of going back to a few months or a few weeks, as it might be, if we were to break this deal apart?
I'm going to park the question about what Congress might do, and I'm going to turn to Baroness Ashton. So the view from Europe is completely different. We had a joint statement from Angela Merkel, Prime Minister May, and Macron on this decision by President Trump. There is a unity within Europe, and I would say many other parts of the world as well, that this is the best deal that we could have got, and is a deal that's working. We see the IAEA Director General Amano talking about how there is no site that they've requested to see that they haven't had access to. And the IAEA is seemingly extremely pleased with progress in a way that they were not before, by the way. As you know, within the IAEA, there were a lot of concerns back in the day. Now they seem to be much more confident in the way forward. So how do you see it from the European point of view? And how might you see Congress acting? There's only a month left, pretty well, before they have to respond to President Trump.
It's great to be here with him, by the way. Though I have to say, if you think it's hard getting a gig if you're a former senator, imagine being a former EU person.
You're very welcome here.
I know. So just a couple of comments first. First of all, this was the most complex and complicated agreement ever done, both in its technical sense, for those of you who do not have PhDs in nuclear physics. Those of us who worked on the deal could probably have got some exams, I think, by the end of it. But it required expertise across the world to be engaged. And it was politically extraordinarily complicated because you had the P5, France, Britain, America, Russia, China, and Germany, because it had started as a European exercise many years before. And it continued even when there were serious challenges going on outside of the agreement discussions that affected those partners, the obvious one being Ukraine. That throughout the crisis in Ukraine, we were still negotiating with the Russians as partners, even if we were sanctioning them at the same time. So it is extraordinary. I worked on it for over 4 years. I did not begin it, and sadly I did not end it. But the length of time and the amount of effort that went into it on all sides was extraordinary. And what came out of it was extraordinary too, because nobody here, I suspect, would have put any money on it even a few months before it was successful. Because what we were asking of Iran was incredibly tough politically for them. And what we were trying to do was collaborate to get the best possible agreement that would give you certainty in what we said about it. And the mandate was really clear. And I think there are 3 sort of reasons why it's found itself out of favor in some quarters. The first is, for some people, even the prospect of talking to Iran was unbelievably unacceptable, especially for some in America who remembered right back to the terrible hostage situation and reflected that Iran was not a country they believed you could ever talk to. There were those who believed that simply by focusing on one issue, we were denying, in a sense, the existence of all the other issues. People would say to me, you have to talk about human rights. You have to talk about the regional issues. You have to do all of these things. To which our answer was very simple. Those are incredibly important issues, but they're a different agreement. They may require different players to participate in them on our side. They're not unimportant. But unless we can sort this out, everything else cannot be. And there were those for whom what I've often called the jigsaw puzzle of the agreement, they didn't like what we'd done on 1 or 2 aspects of the deal itself. Very simply, when you put a jigsaw puzzle together, you get a picture. It might be a rose-covered cottage. It might be a boat at sea. Whatever it is, you know what the picture's telling you. There are no gaps between the pieces. They fit together. But when you're doing an agreement on anything, particularly something this complex, the size and shape of the pieces can be different. If you get a big piece, maybe you can have some smaller pieces to go alongside it. But for some, they were wedded to a particular piece. This had to happen at Fordor. This had to happen with Iraq. We had to have this level of stockpile. We had to do this. We had to do that. And they got mesmerized by the piece and not by the picture. And so inevitably, when our puzzle was put together, there were those who say it's not good enough because it doesn't address in a way they would have liked that particular part of the puzzle. What the American Congress now has to do is look at the agreement. Does it do what it says on the tin or the can? Yes, it does. Does it give us the certainty of the mandate that came from the Security Council, that you can have confidence in the purely peaceful nature of Iran's nuclear program? Those words I would recite in my sleep. Yes, you can. And does it now, potentially at least, allow for other discussions with Iran to take place because we've learned how to do it? Yes, it does. So what I would say to Congress is, look at that, raise your concerns on all of the other questions, missiles, regional concerns, what's happening in Yemen, what's going on in Lebanon, all of those are legitimate questions, and there are a range of responses to them. But do them against a backdrop of having stuck with an agreement that the United States was crucial to negotiating and should be proud of what it did in that sense, and use that, as if you like, as part of the leverage that you use to try and get further in your discussions with Iran, or to help others have those conversations too. And I would say to them finally, if you don't do that, you're saying three things. One, the United States does not stick to an agreement that it made. And I'll tell you, in the conversations that I would have bilaterally with Foreign Minister Zarif, we talked about who the next incumbent in the White House would be and what their view would be, because in the Republican primaries, many candidates talked about the fact they didn't like the deal, that they would rip it up or review it or whatever. So we were not unalive to that. I would say to them, you are sending that message loud and clear, even though the agreement is working, and the amazing Dr. Amano and his team at the International Atomic Energy Authority are clear about that, and they are not people to be hoodwinked. That you are saying to your allies who sat with you for all those years and worked incredibly hard and did their own contributions, because in my 4 years, there were absolutely times when each country, each of them, did something that made it possible for us to move forward, without exception. And I pay tribute to all of them, because there were moments we were really stuck, and they managed one way or another to help us go forward. What is the message that Congress gives to them if it says we're not sticking with this? And thirdly, of course, the message to others with whom dialogue, diplomacy, ultimately, has got to be how we resolve the problems. Because in the end, it's what really matters. You could do all sorts of other things on the way to it, some good, some terrible. You could use all kinds of effort, sticks and carrots, to try and get the problems done and sorted. But in the end, people have to sit down and try and find a way through it, not with naivety, but with determination.
So I am in this terrible dilemma where I've got so many more questions that I want to ask, but I'm also aware of the time, and I want to go out to... We can go a little later?
I'm okay with a little later.
The word little is entirely within my interpretation.
Can I just understand
Yes.
one thing?
On the point Kathy was making, I want to emphasize here today, because I don't want to come in here and avoid certain realities. we do have serious problems with Iran's interference in Yemen or with the missiles, with arms sales and transports that creates mischief. I mean, there are a number of things, and everybody knows what they are. But let me underscore, we didn't do away with those. We kept missile sanctions in the agreement. In fact, Russia and China, together with Iran, were arguing it should be zero. There shouldn't be anything in there. And we held out and said, absolutely, we have to have it. And we're not going to do a deal that doesn't. And we came up with 8 years. So 8 years was not going down. 8 years was going up from zero to keep an 8-year component in there. The arms embargo, we have kept those. Human rights, we kept those. So there are sanctions that we kept in the agreement, notwithstanding Iran's desire to get out from under them and so forth. And by the way, after the agreement was signed, in the last year or so of the Obama administration, we imposed some of those sanctions as a result of actions that Iran took. So it is not inappropriate for Congress to call attention to them. Here's the difficulty. What President Trump regrettably has done by his invective against the deal itself and his sort of throwing to Congress this non-fact-based decertification, he's polluted the pool in a way that whatever Congress does is going to be interpreted as their effort to kill the deal through a back door by pretending it's missiles or pretending it's whatever it is. And it's lost the legitimacy that we had in fact gained for raising those issues in an appropriate way and in fact raising those sanctions. But if you make the politics of Iran so complicated that the IRGC or the Ayatollah has to respond to the narrowing of his own political space to act and keep this in place, you have created a downward spiral that becomes extraordinarily dangerous here. That's the danger of where we stand right now. My hope is that my former colleagues in Congress will recognize that and be very temperate and thoughtful in whatever approach it is that they bring to this, so as not to compound this complicated equation that's been created.
Thank you. Right, I'm going to go out now to the membership and see if we have some speakers. I see in the middle there, is it Dr. Unal? Yep.
Thank you very much, Beyza Unal, Chatham House. My question is to Kerry, actually. When you look back to the negotiation process, is there anything that you say that you could have, or the Obama administration could have done better or differently, that could have actually prevented this process that come to this stage right now, perhaps involving the Republicans into the process as well? Thank you.
I'm going to take a couple more questions and then go back to the speakers, please.
Thank you. Sanam Vakil, Chatham House. I just came back from Washington and I had a number of meetings in Congress and with others. And I came away thinking, or the voices I spoke to sort of intimated that the onus right now is on Europe, particularly leaders in the three capitals in the EU, to assure the Trump administration and Congress that they will protect the deal by offering solutions outside of the deal on the wider-ranging issues to the Trump administration and particularly to the president. So I'm curious to know what steps or what ideas you might have on what and how the EU3 can take in order to preserve the deal by stepping in on these outside issues. Thank you.
And then at the back. Sorry, in the middle there. Yes, thank you.
Sean Curtin, a member of Chatham House. I'd like to ask you about the wider implications of President Trump's stance on the Iran deal on North Korea, which you mentioned a number of times. At the moment, it seems to be a complete stalemate because there doesn't seem to be any way to move forward, because the only way you can move forward without having a military option, which wouldn't really be acceptable, is to have a deal. And what you said to us is that you can't ignore reality, you can't ignore the facts, but isn't the reality that President Trump so chooses to ignore reality? Thank you.
So in the last 2 years, certainly what we've seen is more public diplomacy, thanks to more interaction with senior level people, including the president, on Twitter. We're seeing a lot of things being put forward that way. Is this complicating everything even more than it did, say, 2 years ago?
Yep.
So Kathy, perhaps I can turn to you first.
Well, I was going to pick up the EU leaders' point, if I may, which is that I think the message would be from all of the heads of state and government across Europe that there is a great willingness to work with the United States on all of the issues that would concern Congress and the President and themselves on issues in the case of Iran, in terms of what Iran is doing. And we've mentioned a few of them here already. I think what will be challenging for them is that they would want to do that in the context of building on the work that they have successfully done together, because the agreement that we reached had the endorsement, of course, of the heads of state and government involved as well, in order that you can move forward and drive into those issues together. The problem will be if somehow, and this is what I'm concerned about, it's, okay, there is a problem, you fix it. So EU leaders, you've got to come up with things that you're going to add into this agreement and so on. Because I don't think that's where they would want to go, and I don't think that's the right way to go. But I certainly think huge willingness to say, okay, what are the issues we need to continue now to think about how we work together and collaborate? Because in the European terms, there's huge collaboration between the US and across Europe on a daily basis, from my own experience with it. One little comment on North Korea too, which is actually during the negotiations, the North Koreans were quite interested in what we were doing. And we saw that because we saw where they were, and they would make trips to various places and so on. And that was quite interesting of itself. I don't mean that they would have wanted this process or that there wasn't a process that was better and so on. It was just that they were clearly quite interested in it.
Secretary Kerry.
Well, let me, the EU3 are extremely important right now. I visited with President Macron a few weeks ago in Paris, and we talked about this. And I think he fully recognizes the centrality of the EU3's role at this point in helping Congress and others to shape this. Your ambassadors, the ambassadors from Great Britain, Germany, and France are actually already hard at work meeting with people in Congress and trying to explain the importance of this. But I don't want to go into the details, if you don't mind, of doing things differently or not doing things differently. I think that it was very difficult at one point, I will say, where we had to come out of, I think it was Lausanne, with a not fully finished deal. We had enormous progress that we made, and the reason we had to come out publicly with a not fully finished deal, which I was very reluctant to see happen because I knew it would make our life back at home in the United States much more difficult, and I knew it would make the Iranian life much more difficult. And the only reason we did that was because the threat of Congress, who were about to pass new sanctions. And if new sanctions had been passed in the middle of our negotiating while we were making progress, the whole thing could have just blown up. It would have been the message that the Ayatollah began the negotiations worried about, which is you can't really negotiate with the West, you can't trust the United States, you can't trust the negotiation. And Kathy remembers this. I mean, this was a huge hurdle we had to get over in this process to build up enough sense that these two countries that hadn't talked to each other in 35 years which have very different views of the world and of the region, we're suddenly going to be able to find a common ground. So we got over that hurdle, but I'm telling you, it made it so much more difficult, and we wound up being exposed to 60 days of major advertising against the deal, major lobbying and so forth, rather than a shorter span of time, because we had to go public and ignited something. So words have consequences. Public positions people take have consequences. The threat of Congress interfering has serious consequences on a negotiation. And right now, what I worry about is that and this goes to the question that was asked about North Korea. What are the implications of President Trump's stance on North Korea and of the comments he makes? Well, let me tell you something, folks. If you go to the well of the United Nations and you stand up in front of the world and you use that precious podium to send a message that you're going to destroy someone else's country, you're giving them a pretty good reason to say, you see, everything I told you about their threat is real. This is why I have to have a bomb. And it hardens positions domestically. And when, certain terminology and shorthand monikers are applied to a particular leader in public in ways that are insulting in their view, that just hardens them down. It becomes more personal. And when it becomes more personal, it's much harder to resolve. Now, North Korea, I want to make, and this is a point the world needs to begin to focus on. I hear people say to me, oh, you tried diplomacy with North Korea. It failed. You haven't done, can't you realize that the only thing they're going to understand is force? Well, folks, no, we have not exhausted diplomacy. And let me be explicit about that. We spent 35 years working up to where we got to with Iran. We had tougher sanctions in place against Iran, which did not have a nuclear weapon, than we do today against North Korea, which does. Go figure. So I'm saying that we have only just begun the plateau of ratcheting up those sanctions. We began it in our administration. We had 2 escalations with China, and the Trump administration has had 2 escalations with China. And now those sanctions are beginning to bite. And I believe China is the key. We thought that a few years ago. It remains the key today. 100% of the fuel that drives every truck, every car in North Korea, flies every airplane, comes from China. 100% of the banking, such as it is, that North Korea is able to effect, goes through Beijing. Beijing has every possibility in the world of bringing greater pressure on North. And what they say to you usually in the dialogue is, well, we're very worried about the stability of the peninsula, and we don't want an implosion of the regime. But I would point out, as we did many times, we are not close to the point of implosion. And China has many tools available in its toolbox to be able to put that pressure on and make a difference here. My hope is that China will do that, and that President Trump on his current trip will succeed in moving this ball forward. We all have the same interest. We want this to be successful. But I believe we still can bring greater pressure to bear, and the goal, which Secretary Tillerson has talked about, of trying to get to a freeze for a freeze, and then begin to try to move to a different position of diplomacy, is the goal that I think we ought to be pursuing, and it would be greatly helped by not having a personal Twitter war or other kind of war that could make a different kind of war far more likely.
But please don't stop tweeting from this meeting. John Snoke, please.
Mr. Kerry, I wondered what...
Do you want to wait for the microphone? That'd be great. Thank you.
I just wondered whether you felt that the United States is honouring the deal. When you're on the ground in Tehran, I can tell you it's pretty clear the French and the Germans are pushing the boundaries of whatever they can possibly do in terms of trade and access to banking and the rest of it. But there's a very, very strong sense that the American banking sanctions are still gripping the situation, and people are beginning to run out of confidence in that aspect of the whole thing.
Elise, please start forward. Thank you.
Lise Doucette of the BBC. The so-called other issues include two fronts, broadly speaking, the ballistic missiles and Iran's behavior in the region. I mean, Patricia, you first asked that question about Congress, so maybe I'll resurrect it. What can either the US Congress or Europe, Russia, China do to address that issue, and in what form? When it comes to the so-called that Iran's behavior in the region, many say that should be done through negotiations, but the Arab world, or particularly the Gulf Arab states, say that Iran has no business discussing what should be Arab issues in the Arab world. How worried are you by the forced resignation of Saad Hariri could be the beginning of a different way of dealing with it, which is by threats, and of course there is always the risk of other actions being taken as well? Thank you.
Thank you. And a question just here, please.
Thank you. Vincent DiLorenzo, a member of the Chatham House. So many parallels between North Korea and Iran. And I wonder, Secretary Kerry, if you can comment on the history of North Korea and in 1994 with the agreed framework. And President Clinton had an opportunity to engage them militarily, and he decided on the agreed framework. And now we have the situation we have now. So was that a mistake? Should we have engaged militarily in 1994 and we would not have North Korea with nuclear weapons right now? And how does that apply to this agreement? Thank you.
So one of the things is to really contrast the Cato deal with the JCPOA, I think, which is a very important thing to do. And
Yeah.
I would say as well, Secretary Kerry, when you were here last year, you were saying to people that it's really important to have confidence and investment in Iran, and your fear was that this confidence was lacking. And can you maybe address that as well, because I think that this is something that many people are saying this is why we were holding back this new version of events from the US administration.
Absolutely, Patricia. This is a very legitimate question. I organized a meeting here in London together with then Foreign Minister Philip Hammond. And we brought all the top banks of Europe into the meeting in order to talk about the need to get over this hurdle of secondary sanctions, in order that we keep our side of the deal. As I said to you, I think it's important to be a fair broker in all of these things, and I think it is vital for the Western world, not just the West actually, it's all parties, though there's less reservation in other parts of the world than in the West, to engage openly in business with Iran. And unfortunately, some people are putting pressures on that scares some corporate entities, and they back off a little bit. They're slower to move as a result. And Iran has reason to be concerned that those secondary sanctions are still standing in the way of their ability to be able to do business to the level that they should. Now, if you're an opponent of the deal, I guess that's one way of backdoor attacking the deal. And it's a constant fight that we have faced since the very first moment that we initiated this. You've heard figures thrown around that Iran suddenly has billions and billions of dollars to throw around, et cetera, and they're using it in nefarious activities. The truth is that the figure of 155 billion, which was first put on the table as what they might receive, and then it receded to about 100, is nowhere near what in reality Iran has received. All of us have been surprised. I was genuinely surprised by the very little amount of money that actually flowed. It's in the double digits of billions, but low double digits. It is nowhere near what was anticipated. And by the way, it's their money. It's their money that we were paying exorbitant amounts of interest on. And had we not decided to pay it then, we'd be paying it somewhere in the future in even larger amounts because of the interest that was accruing, because it comes from the money that was, from the payments that were blocked when the weapons were not sold that had been previously paid for by Iran. They were never transferred. And so it has accrued a significant interest in the intervening years. So
Well,
I think we have to address that question.
Let me just turn to Baroness Ashton and ask about the banking sector in the Europe zone, and whether or not there's a way of providing confidence for that banking sector that if new sanctions are imposed in the United States, that they won't fall foul. This is a big problem with multinationalism generally.
Sure. I mean, one of the things we know from all the other discussions we have about trade and investment is how our corporations are all interconnected. And so it was no surprise that there was a chilling effect, if I call it that, on those who were concerned that if they were engaged with either guarantees or operating, especially in the banking sector, to support our businesses who wanted to do trade and investment with Iran, that they would be caught by another wave of sanctions coming out of the US, which would be extremely expensive, if nothing else. So there is a real sense, I think, at the moment that amongst a number of our different sectors, that they're not absolutely sure what they can do, what they should do, and the implications for the future, and the discussions in boardrooms are to that effect, which is why John was here talking about the need to give some confidence in that. And that's something I think European leaders will have to think about as they see how this unravels. I just wanted to have a couple of things about what Lisa was asking about the region. The thing is, that for us anyway, that when the agreement with Iran was done, it wasn't a case of stopping talking. It was, in a sense, the opportunity to now talk about something else. And it may very well be that the team who were working on the Iran nuclear deal would not be the team of people who'd be talking to them about issues that directly concern the Gulf countries, the Arab world, the region itself, but that the capacity to have a model of how to do it was already in existence. And for me, one of the questions for Congress is, are we going to get going on all these other things? We need to start using the ability we have and the people that have done it, that exist within the departments. There were many, many people from the US and many people from all the other nations who have worked on this agreement, who have great experience and expertise, who could be beginning to think about it within a framework that looks at both carrots and sticks. And you're going to have to think very carefully about what that should look like, and it needs to be with the people who feel most directly affected.
Thank you.
So there was a couple of other really interesting questions, and one of them I want to try to tackle because I think it's an opportunity diplomatically. On the issue of Hariri's resignation and the issue of Iran in the backyard, I think, again, and I tend to always believe, look, we're wearing these things for a reason. These poppies are a remembrance of how really badly things go when accidents or indecision or wrong decisions or misunderstandings are allowed to make decisions about a war. And if ever there was an example for humankind of the stupidity of wave after wave of human beings being sent over the trenches to fight each other and die within seconds, for the absurdity of war, this is it. That's why I wear this. And as a veteran of Vietnam, with the Ken Burns series having just played in the United States, reminding people of the deceptions, the miscalculations, the lack of understanding, the misjudgments, I am particularly sensitive to the notion that you need to exhaust diplomacy before you wind up making a decision to go to war. Now, with respect to the Middle East, there's a major churning taking place. I have great respect, frankly, for what the Crown Prince, the Crown Prince now in Saudi Arabia and King Salman are trying to do to move Saudi Arabia into modernity. It's a huge lift, folks, huge challenge to try to change those societies. And together with the Emiratis and others, they are taking a very firm stand against the extremism that in its duplicitous form has been allowed to play a game out there. That's part of what this challenge with Qatar is about. It's not just about two nations in the region squabbling. It's about this bigger vision of where we are going and whether we're going to stop extremism and not have, I can tell you, it got in the way of our efforts to resolve Libya. It got in the way of our efforts to resolve Syria. There are about 6 different wars taking place in Syria. And a lot of them have to do with proxies and the expenditure of funds within Islam on extremist entities and other things. So the bottom line is, I think that there is an opportunity now for the region to begin a more robust diplomacy, to begin to try to deal with these backyard issues. I've had these conversations with various Iranian interlocutors, and my judgment is that to some degree, a Persian 10% of Islam, it's not just Persian, by the way, Shia is 10% of Islam. Persian Shia is a smaller percentage. But how that represents a hegemonic threat to 90% Sunni Arab world is very hard to comprehend, yet it's driving the conflict in much of the region. And Iran, for its part, sees itself to some degree being threatened. You've got to therefore deal with each country's perception of threat. And if you don't begin to deal with another country's perception of threat, you can't make a good decision about what's happening. And it takes talking to be able to do that. So I think it's very important at this point in time. The conversations I've had with various people, Iran helped us get several ceasefires in Yemen. Iran helped me get a signature from al-Houthi and from Saleh for a peace agreement with respect to Yemen, where they would go back to Kuwait and begin to negotiate. And it wasn't they who broke it apart, it was Hadi who refused to live up to it and come to the table. So we can't allow knee-jerk, rather politically driven sloganeering to dominate big geostrategic decision-making, which is at stake at this moment in the region. And I would urge diplomacy. I urged it to my friends in the course of the last 3 days when I was in the Emirates at the Surbani Yas Forum. I think it is very important to find, even if it's a back channel, even if it's not an open dialogue yet, because it isn't ripe. I think it's really important to understand the road ahead, because we are wasting massive amount of energy globally on these very localized and personalized kinds of squabbles, when we need to be doing massively important things to take 1.8 billion people under the age of 15 and make sure that the 300+ million of them who aren't going to go to school tomorrow are actually going to go to school. Or deal with climate change, where we're already seeing massive refugees as a consequence of what is happening on the planet. There are big, big issues which should be driving the global community, the G20 and others, and we don't have space for wasting the kind of time that is being wasted when there are much bigger challenges in front of all of us in terms of bad governance and other things. Final comment on the Iran parallels to North Korea. The North Koreans cheated. The framework was there. It wasn't as detailed as what we have today. Should have been, could have been maybe. But they also feel that the West didn't follow through because there was supposed to be a transfer of oil. That never took place, so it just broke down. That's why the additional protocol was created. And so I don't see a parallel in the agreement that we made, because this is far more accountable, far more transparent, far more reaching into the future with certainty because of the additional protocol which came out of the failure of the North Korean experience in the framework.
I'm very aware of the time, and I know you've been really generous in giving us these little extra time, you said, and it's been 15 minutes extra, so I really appreciate it. But I wanted to just end by asking both of you a question about the future. I'm very struck by the fact that a couple of weeks ago we had Secretary Johnson speaking on the issue of nuclear weapons at the London conference that we held. We had Prime Minister Netanyahu speaking on nuclear weapons on Iran. We're having issues about nuclear weapons with North Korea. Next year is the 50th anniversary of the signing of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. We have not used these weapons in conflict since 1945, or whether they have not been used in conflict since 1945, and now they're raising that prospect again. We haven't had any negotiations in Geneva for over 20 years. We use the Non-Proliferation Treaty to call, rightly so, Iran to account, North Korea to account. The US is building up nuclear missiles again. Russia is building up its nuclear capabilities again. Do you, either of you, see a way in which this type of technology can be better controlled and can eventually lead to what we have promised to in the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, to abolish these weapons? So, Kathy, do you have any? I mean, the European Union is committed to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty in a way that I see very few other entities show that commitment.
It is, and it is for good reasons. There is no question that when you think about where we are now, it can feel extremely worrying, scary. And it's why I think the push to use diplomacy is even more important than ever before. It's the best weapon we've got. And we can show some success with it. If you look at what happened in Colombia, I did a little thing with Serbia and Kosovo, the big negotiation we've been talking about today. There are undoubtedly opportunities to try and use our diplomatic skills more effectively, because the alternative is terrible. When you were talking about it, one of the things I did, which I think, John, you did too, was I went to Hiroshima and I laid a wreath there in a place where you see the impact still of what can happen when nuclear weapons are used. When you think about how much concern there is right now about the potential for people to get the technology and the implications of that, then I would say, if ever there was a moment to get the diplomats at work, this is it.
And they were at work in New York earlier this year, negotiating the nuclear ban treaty. We've had the ICANN for that work, getting the Nobel Prize this year, which they'll accept in a few weeks' time. So things can move forward on the multilateral level. Secretary Kerry? Sorry.
Well, yeah, but I think actually getting rid of them is the harder part of it. I think that I'm actually, I mean, notwithstanding what I've laid out as complicated challenges we face, I'm an optimist, and I'm very confident about our ability to do these things. But it really depends on quality of leadership. You know, we've had people who've had visions, whether it's been Winston Churchill or Franklin Roosevelt or Woodrow Wilson or whomsoever, in the course of history. We don't see that right now, I regret to say, enough. There are some people who have it. The people in the best positions to be able to use it and lead are not. And you know, I think President Putin, frankly, is missing major opportunity of understanding the role that he could play at this point in time versus the role that he has chosen to play. And if he is going to be driven by personal reactions or by his sense of injury to Russia, Mother Russia writ large historically, and the loss of the Soviet Union, that could be problematic from all of us. But if he wants to really lift Russia to a new place, I think he has an opportunity to lead and offer opportunities on nuclear weapons and other things, rather than challenging the INF Treaty and leading us perhaps to a set of miscalculations. Now, the same is true for my president. And the same is true for the United States. We have to offer that vision. We have to be willing to show the world the direction we want to proceed in. And President Kennedy did that, certainly, with the Test Ban Treaty. You know, I was very pleased in my final years in the Senate as chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, to lead the ratification of the START Treaty. But everything since then has been allowed to get caught up in a kind of cynicism and pessimism that is dominating public dialogue almost everywhere, partly as a consequence of the unwillingness to be honest and lay out facts and agree on what the facts are. If we deal in a factless world, which is what is happening, folks, we're going to have a lot of trouble governing this planet no matter who's there. My colleague, Pat Moynihan, in the Senate had a wonderful saying. He said, you know, everybody's entitled to their own opinion, but you're not entitled to your own facts. And President Adams said facts are stubborn things, and they should be stubborn things because they are facts. Well, the fact is the world will be safer if we move in a different direction from this bellicosity and this you know, overheated rhetoric and you know, personalization of these issues in a way that could lead you to making the kind of mistakes that created a lot of poppies today. So my hope is that we can get back to a better global dialogue. It's part of the reason why I'm here now, and it's part of why Kathy and a lot of us are fighting for this Iran deal, because this is a moment of confrontation with reality and with facts. And the facts say that this deal is working, that you're better off with it than without it. Notwithstanding, not every danger has been eliminated, nor will it be by any one agreement. But we're moving in the right direction, and we have to keep moving in the right direction. I'll close by saying to all of you that you look at the world today, far fewer people are dying of violence than they were in the last century. Kathy mentioned going to that memorial, 30 million people. Russia, by the way, never gets enough credit for 30 million people dying in World War II. And Russia was on the side of fighting against fascism in the course of World War II. People forget that. So there are ways for us to find this commonality. We're on the brink of being the first, you know, seeing the first generation of children born AIDS-free in Africa because we've engaged. We stopped Ebola in its tracks in West Africa when they were predicting 1 million people were going to die in a couple of years. We've been able to deal with the refugees, difficult, very complicated. We've been able to stem that tide to a degree. We've been able to change this. We're curing diseases we never imagined we would cure. When I was in college, the severe poverty level in the planet was over 50%. Today, for the first time in human history, it's below 10%. 450 million people have been brought into middle class in China, in India, in other parts of the world. Korea was a donor recipient, an aid recipient 15 years ago. Today, it's a donor country. So I would just leave everybody on an optimistic note, which somehow Britain particularly seems to be conflicted about. But it is that Europe, you know, what we put in place post-World War II has worked. And Europe is living a higher standard of living and greater you know, length of life and lifestyle than most people in the world as a result of it. We shouldn't allow ourselves to be turned away from the optimism that should guide us by the light of what we have achieved and what has guided us over these past 70, 80 years. And I hope folks will wake up to that as you consider the future in the near term here.
Well, you both have shown great leadership in your work, in negotiating this deal, and I think now in trying to make sure that people understand it thoroughly, that people are thinking about it on a facts-based and evidence-based approach. And we in Chatham House thank you for that leadership and for everything you've done. So thank you very much.